Okay, yeah, so I'm going to talk about heifer development, beef heifer development. I told the guys at lunch that I was the token beef guy here. So the first diagram that's up really has nothing to do with nutrition, but rather is kind of a description of what happens in the first 12 months of life. And I've learned since being in Brazil, traveling to Brazil a lot the last 10 years, that I need to put Boss Taurus up here in the top because these would be typical heifers in Ohio, in the temperate regions of the U.S. Now, in all these, in the process of puberty, regardless of when it occurs, they all have this peripubertal period. And this shading is estradiol negative feedback, and the white line is LH secretion. And we're not really going to talk any about that today, except that negative feedback goes down, LH goes up, and that's when puberty occurs. What I think is more important to our topic today is what's happening before this peripubertal period. And we know in all heifers they go through, most anyway, go through a static period where if we look at ovarian function, the follicle population is there, follicle waves are growing normally, hypothalamus is functional. If we remove inhibitors, it'll release GnRH, pituitary likewise. But they have a static phase where everything seems in place, it just doesn't go. And then the first 6 months, 5 to 6 months, is really the most interesting to me because there are a lot of things happening here. When a heifer's born, there's not very many antral follicles. By 6 months, she has more follicles at a given time in her ovaries than any other time in her life. And that's driven by LH increasing. That's preceded by GnRH. And so there are some developmental processes going along at this time. Now, those of you that look in the literature and you look at heifer development, there are lots and lots of reports about what we feed in the post-weaning period, how that affects whether or not a heifer is going to reach puberty at the time of her first breeding season. And in Boss Taurus heifers, we're talking about breeding out here starting about 12 or 13 up to about 15 months of age. And so all these experiments with post-weaning nutrition have really led us, and I just summarize on this slide, if we're breeding at 13 to 15 months, that we should feed heifers to about 65% of their mature body weight, 60 to 65%. How they get there between weaning and the start of the breeding season doesn't seem to make a huge difference, whether they gain weight early and stabilize, whether they're restricted, and so forth. We want them to reach puberty 30 to 45 days before their first season. Why? Because in the second or third cycle, they're more fertile than they are in their third, or than they are in their first. Now, a pretty popular topic today is to try to reduce cost of heifer development, feeding to a smaller target of 50-55% of mature body weight. And lots of data out there shows that if we do this, we save money. If we look at pregnancy rate through the entire breeding season, that it's the same whether we go to 55 or 65. I think I'm not going to talk about that today, but I think this is an important thing that we need to look at for the next few years of what are the lifetime productivity of animals developed this way as compared to those that are developed to these heavier weights. We don't have that data. We know the costs up to a year are up to the first breeding, but not subsequently. Now, we're going to talk for a while about nutrition in the pre-weaning period. And Milo, who was up here earlier, his father told us that what the nutritional status of animals, of heifer calves in the pre-weaning period will impact when puberty occurs in, at least in beef heifers. And so we've known for a long time that this period is important. And what we've seen over the last decade, last 15 years, though, is actually we are detecting a lot of precocious puberty in beef heifers. Why? How do we usually detect this? We usually detect this when a heifer lays down to calve when she's 14 months or 15 months or 16 months of age. And this seems to be increasing in our population. Whether it's due to genetic selection, we're not sure, but it happens frequently, spontaneously. Well, we looked at this several years ago and wanted to use this response as a way to try to understand how nutrition signals the reproductive axis in female cattle to make it begin to work for the first time. And so we did a series of experiments, actually about 6 of them, using a model where we take beef heifers, Angus, Simmental, or crosses of those, wean them somewhere between 2 and 4 months of age, and then place these heifers on either a high-energy diet, and we've tried high-concentrate diets, we've tried diets that provide high energy without the high starch content, and we get essentially the same response. But all these diets formulated for about 1.5 kilograms of gain per day, these heifers would never get to that. In most of these studies, about 1.25 kilos a day. The control diet, we went and looked at the growth rate of our heifers, at least from 2 months of age up to 7 months of age, and these diets were formulated to support those gains, which were about 0.75, and really pretty effective at controlling this gain in all these experiments. So these heifers went on these diets. We looked at a lot of different endpoints, and I'll mention those as we go through. When we talk about precocious puberty, we actually are talking about puberty in beef heifers that occurs before 300 days of age. So to give you an idea of the impact of these diets during that time, at 300 days of age, this is just from one of the experiments, heifers weighed at about 300 kilos. So they're developing normally, 640 pounds. If we put them on the high energy, in this particular experiment, we added about 60 kilos to their body weight. So yes, we're making them gain more rapidly, but it's a gradual separation that starts out here at about 150 days of age. When we do this, this is what happens to puberty. And so in this particular study, there's only 9 heifers in each group, but what you see is starting at 200 days of age, a heifer reaches puberty, another shortly after, and by 300 days of age, 9 of 10 have started to cycle already. These are where those precocious pregnancies come from in the feedlot, in our cow herds, are heifers that receive this signal from whatever they're consuming, pre-weaning, and have precocious puberty. This response very typical for heifers in our production system. So if we look and compare 4 of the experiments, you can see our capacity to induce precocious puberty pretty high. We only got 2/3 of the heifers induced in the 3rd experiment. Average age of puberty, right at 8.5 months. And if we look out here at the control animals, very typical age of puberty for Bos taurus heifers of this type. Now, one thing that's interesting when we talk about spontaneous puberty, precocious puberty, 1 year our controls started to cycle before 300 days. Over half of them did. So precocious puberty we are aiding it with the high energy diet, but it was happening in some of the animals even without that kind of stimulus. So really what we think we've done in terms of sexual maturation in these animals, we've taken away the static period. Remember that interval where everything just shuts down. It's waiting until the peripubertal. It shifts back here. Here's the increase in LH, the fall in estradiol negative feedback. This is the maximum diameter of the largest follicle. This is estradiol production by that follicle, and so everything just shifts back 3 or 4 months when they receive this high energy feeding beginning about 3 months of age. So, how do we use these? How do we use this kind of information in animal or beef cattle production? First thing you know, and I'm sure some of you are sitting there and thinking, puberty at 250 days of age doesn't fit in our seasonal production. Absolutely not. Nobody wants to go out and make all their heifers cycle at 8 months of age so they can get them pregnant at that time. What it might tell us is why this is happening, and theoretically you could figure out a way to prevent this or avoid it, or at least know that it's going to happen. So really this is how you would not use these data to induce precocious puberty. What we know, probably one of the most important responses, we know that if we give high energy from 3 to 6 months, heifers will reach puberty sooner. We looked at the LH secretion, follicle development, negative feedback, all those things, and it just shifts all those endocrine changes to a younger age. We think this is directed by IGF. Matt Lucy sitting over here, he has really good data in Holstein heifers showing the same kind of relationships of how IGF responds to high nutrition in these young animals, and it's linked to setting this off. We haven't done a lot of work with this in heifers since these experiments, but we have used this in some of our experiments with bull calves. You know, we're in the genomic era with bull calves that are those stars for artificial insemination. The younger you can get semen out of those bulls, the more valuable they are. These kind of nutritional programs, coupled with other things, may well help us get semen from those bulls several months earlier than we normally would in AI. No question really to us that there's an existence of a window in development during which enhanced nutrition will augment maturation of the reproductive axis. So, a question really that comes up next, when is this window? And can nutrition be used maybe in models where puberty is a problem? So the first set of data here, and I apologize to our next speaker, I saw this reference was in her report, and I only have one slide about this report, and it's a completely different model, but I think it lends to this existence of this sensitive period. It's Holstein heifer calves, differential feeding, 2 to 42 days of age. I could get myself in trouble talking about rearing dairy heifers, but I think this is a normal rate of gain. This is an accelerated rate of gain. And I know some of the feeding had an increased protein content. But this is only 40 days in the first 2 months of life with differential feeding. In fact, if you looked at weights in this study, body weights of these animals did not differ after 12 weeks of age. So, of course, they were different at the end of 42 days, but not for most of their life. But the important number is right here, that this 40-day difference, or this 40 days of differential feeding, resulted in a difference in age of puberty of a month, of 31 days. So that was able to carry forward up to 300 days of age. They were lighter, which you'd expect them to be lighter if they reach puberty at a younger age. I think I'll avoid all these others down here except to say age of conception was reduced by about 15 days. Age at first conception, first pregnancy. So this was able to carry forward. So I've got to beat Lucy, so you think about my question. This is showing. Okay, let's move on. I think some very important data that has come out relatively recently, and obviously the model where this information might be more useful is in Bos indicus influenced heifers. And this report is from Texas A&M, Cardosa et al., Gary Williams and Marcel M. Stalden, which tragically was killed in an accident, a car accident earlier this year. But they've done a lot of work in trying to determine how we can feed animals to program their development early in life, feed heifers early in life. Important number here, 25% Brahman. I'm in Florida. Had a chance earlier this year, or last October, to travel across from Ona to Okeechobee. There was a little bit of work and a lot of other things going on at that time with some Brazilians that were here. But the point is, you can see the type of cattle through the southern part of the U.S. These guys asked the question, like we showed in Boss Taurus, will this increase nutrition during early maturation, advanced puberty, in Brahman-influenced heifers? They took this a little further in asking the question that if this is a finite period, in all of our studies, we put them on high energy and left them there. If we give them a window of about 10 weeks at a strategic time, will that advance age of puberty? And they also tried to take advantage of compensatory gain in this study, where they'd have 10 weeks of high energy, 10 weeks of restricted energy, come back to high energy, where you get those high compensatory responses in those animals. So the design looks a little complex here, but not too bad once you get into it. They started at 4 months of age in these quarter Brahman heifers, 4 to 6.5, 6.5 to 9, 9 to 11.5, 11.5 to 13 months of age were the 4 periods. High control, those fed a high level of energy throughout to gain 1 kilogram a day. Low control at 0.5 kilogram a day throughout. And then 2 SS or stair step. 1 SS1, they had an ad libitum consumption of this diet that was fed up here for 10 weeks, followed by a low energy restriction, again high energy, and then restriction at this point in time. Remember, breeding season starts right here as you try to put these in the context of what you're doing to these heifers. The SS2 started from 4 to 6.5 months of age. They had 10 weeks of nutritional restriction, high energy, so compensatory gain, low, and then high. And they did a good job of feeding these animals. The responses, really just as you would expect. Here's the low controls. Gained 0.55 kilos a day. High controls got to almost 0.9. Those are in the next slide. The interesting ones, here's the stair step one, very rapid gains from 4 to 6.5 months in this first 10 weeks. Then slow gain after that time, compensatory gain, and then a restricted diet here where they slowed down. The reverse, SS2, slow gain the first 10 weeks, very rapid compensatory gain, slow gain, and then compensatory gain again. Probably an important thing to realize is at this point, when we got out to this 12-month time, the 3 diets, all except the low control, had attained just about the same body weight. So to put those in numerical form, 0.55 was the average daily gain in the low controls. 0.9 was the average in the high controls. Stair step 1, you can see they outgained everybody in that first ad libitum period. Very slow gains, week 10 to 20, compensatory gain, and they'd all reached puberty, so they don't have a number there. And the converse here with stair step 2, a very high impact or rate of gain in those animals at 6.5 months that went on the high nutrition. So if we go then to this slide, and I want you to concentrate there, I just put this one here. This is the one we just looked at 2 slides ago to kind of put you in context of where these observations are relative to this feeding period. So week 16 is right here in the middle of phase 2. So at this point, you've got the low controls, high controls doing their thing. The stair step 1s are actually in nutritional restriction. Stair step 2s are going through a very rapid 1.3 kilos a day gain during that time. what this figure shows is the cumulative percentage of heifers that reach puberty. You can see by 24 weeks, in 3 of the 4 treatments, there were already 2 of the 10 heifers in each group that had cycled. As we moved forward, there was no difference in the high control or the stair-step ones. So that 2-phase feeding in the stair-step ones actually was as effective as the high nutrient consumption throughout the high control diet. The low controls, about what you would expect. And then these SS2s, though, are kind of interesting. If the breeding season is starting right about this time, 90% of them reach puberty. And so this stair-step seemed to aid them, certainly relative to the low controls, but they developed at an almost normal pace. So, summary from this experiment: enhanced early development, or nutrition during early development, advanced puberty, no question. Stair-step 1 in high controls. This 4 to 6.5 months of age, followed by the stair-step, was as effective as the high energy throughout. Suggests that in these Brahman-influenced heifers, this high energy during early development programs their reproductive axis. So, when I talk about this to some producers, they go, well, I'm not going to wean my calves when they're 3 months old or 4 months old. They actually wean very easily at that time from a health standpoint, and they love to eat. However, you could put this into a program, and I want to give kudos to John Arthington, which many of you know, at ONA, at the UF station at ONA. He's worked a lot with early weaning programs, really targeting rebreeding of Primiparous cows, and with some of the seasonal changes in forage availability. If you manage those heifers right, you probably are going to do better with them when you breed those animals. I think this is worth hanging on to, that 90% of the heifers in the stair-step 2 had reached puberty by 13 months of age. So they're Brahman-influenced heifers that'll calve at 2 years of age pretty readily. Suggests that even without early weaning, that they might be sensitive to this boost of nutrition in that age range from 6 to 9 months. Some questions: is the stair-step necessary? And do we have to have a period of restriction and high energy and do this twice to realize some of these benefits? Where am I at, Charlie? 10 minutes? Okay. So, at this point, I want to transition a little bit, go a step further, and talk about using some of this technology in cattle that really need help in terms of inducing puberty at a younger age. And this project is a big one that's gone on since 2008 in Brazil, really working with Nelore cattle, a Bos Indicus breed, or half-bloods, Nelore Angus half-bloods, and really asking the question, should they calve at 2 years of age? In Brazil, these animals calve at 3. They don't get pregnant at 3. They get a chance to calve at 4. And if you move north up by the Amazon, some of them don't calve until 5 years of age. And so, I think for a long time the thought was that they can't do it, at least the straight breds. I want to recognize these two guys. They're veterinarians. His family owns the ranch we worked at, about 5,000 cows. And this is the herd vet, a graduate student with Dr. Vasconcelos, who some of you know, at UNESP. Steve Lurch, you might recognize that name. He's now at Illinois. And Leandro's a PhD student with me. So can these heifers get pregnant? Will they get pregnant again at 2 years of age? As soon as we started talking about getting them pregnant to calve at 2, the next question was, will they ever rebreed? And is it economically feasible? We've been doing this for a long time. We've still got a lot of questions to answer, but but you'll see we've got quite a bit of data. So we're talking about animals of this type. Luckily, this ranch has a feedlot that they were originally a feeding operation, so they can provide different nutrients. The end game for this innovative ranch is this right here, an F1 Angus Nelore with a Brangus calf. They're in Goiás, kind of central Brazil, and these cattle so far are doing very well. In the kind of forage that we see south of here, the brachiatas, the low protein kind of diets. When we started in 2008, we were trying to make these black calves. Now there's not a Nelore heifer bred in this ranch. So it's moved that far in the last 6 years. And the heifers we work with, here's a good example of some Nelore heifers in about August, and then some half-bloods in September. So these are the animals we've had in this experiment from 2008 up to 2014. I will tell you this year we bred another 900 Angus. When it says Angus, it means half Angus, half Nelore. But you can see pretty good numbers of heifers across this time. Began breeding Angus in 212, 213. Or we had Angus half-blood heifers at that time. Just to kind of give you an idea, weaning weights around 200 kilos of these heifers. Their weight at AI, by and large in the Nelore, we targeted 300 kilos. In the Angus crossbreds, they're a little harder to control, but I think if we took all those heifers that we've had in this study, they would average around 325 kilograms. So in this instance, they are weaned between 6 and 9 months. They're put into the feedlot, a diet consisting primarily of corn silage and supplement. And each year we've cut this back, the energy consumption or the energy density of the diet as these animals have come through this program. Now, I'm not going to talk a lot about this, but in this program, not only were we using nutrition, but we were using hormonal intervention. This is a really common approach in Brazil, particularly with straight-bred Nelore, where you insert a cedar for 12 days. It's called an induction protocol. At the end of that protocol, you give them a little kick of estradiol, then you put them into a Time AI protocol. I will tell you that this year, with the F1 Angus Nelore, we didn't use this. We got the same results as what I'm going to show you today. With this nutritional intervention, they don't need the induction. I think the Nelore probably do. The second thing I'll tell you, most of the data I'll show you is from 2 Time AIs. This is the common breeding method, at least at this ranch. You Time AI the heifers. 30 days later, you preg check, and you resynchronize those. And so the pregnancy rates are from 2 opportunities with Time AI. I'm just showing you data from 1 year, but I will tell you the Nelore are very similar, and the F1 Angus Nelore in terms of their pregnancy rates. In this year, the Angus were 13 months of age at the first Time AI, 62% got pregnant. The Nelore, the straightbreds, were a little younger, 46%. So a very acceptable number here, an excellent number here. We're happy with that if we get that in our Angus Simmental heifers in Ohio. And so these programs are working on the first Time AI. Now, if we go, the next slide is before I do that. Was this a weight thing? Was it the heavy heifers or the light heifers? No relationship. These are the pregnant heifers to Time AI, non-pregnant to Time AI for the Angus Nelore. Same with the Nelore. So it's not that the heifers that develop well get pregnant. I'm not sure we know why. Some are and some aren't. Resynchronized, it's actually 40 days later. Half of the non-pregnants here got pregnant to resynchrony. The Nelore, this is a pretty normal response. If they don't get pregnant the first time, they don't breed very well on the second AI. And we're probably hitting the ceiling in this population. So if we look at total pregnancy rate to time AI, 80% and 60%, these are the half-bloods, these are the straight breds. So with 2 AIs, we got to that point. And actually, this is pretty consistent from year to year. I'm just going to make a couple of comments about the Primiparous cows. In this program, they come in and they calve in pastures where they can be fed supplemental silage. They're given a time AI, turned out to pasture. When we do this, this was the data from the first year, and these are straight bred Nelore, 57% to the first AI, 36% to the Re-Synch. In this case, we put in bulls, 87% pregnancy rate. This is a little bit of an anomaly. If we look at our straight bred Nelores, Primiparous Nelores, this pregnancy rate is about 70% on the average. Some of the more amazing data, the Primiparous F1 Angus Nelore, 88% with 2 AIs. So over these years, it would be 70% with the Nelore and about 85% with the Nelore Angus. So from that project, a majority of these high Bos indicus proportioned, that have a high proportion of Bos indicus will calve and rebreed. Now, when you say majority in Nelore, it's 60%, and in Angus half-bloods, it's 80%. Nutritional management, time AI program are needed. Induction, probably not in the F1s. Nelore, a big move now is improved genetics for age of puberty. And when we do economic analysis, it always favors 2 years of calving at 2 years versus 3 years, just like it did in the U.S. in 1921 when we were trying to decide whether our heifers should calve. Overall, intensified feeding advances puberty. There's variation or flexibility for timing of this, and this window might be different between breeds, environments, and production systems. I think the bottom line, jumping down here, I know I'm out of time, Charlie, nutritional status for the entire time from birth to first breeding is going to impact reproductive success. A lot of talk now about fetal programming. We also need to consider programming that occurs in that early period after birth.